Daniel Hughes, a beloved lawyer with a picture-perfect life, and Kevin Lawson, his best friend and secret lover, shared a bond that no one could have imagined would lead to murder. On the night Daniel married Jessica Parker, the woman he seemed destined to be with, a twisted betrayal was set in motion. One that would shatter everything. As the vows were exchanged and the celebration unfolded, Daniel's wedding night took a dark turn, ending in brutal violence and a deadly secret that no one saw coming. The town of Silver Brook had always been known for its small-town charm, quaint streets lined with old oaks, a tight-knit community, and a sense of safety that made it seem like nothing ever went wrong. So, when Daniel Hughes and Jessica Parker's wedding was announced, it felt like the entire town had been waiting for this moment. The couple was beloved. Daniel, a successful lawyer with an easy smile, and Jessica, a school teacher with an infectious laugh, were the epitome of what everyone imagined a perfect couple to be. They were both popular in the community, and their love story seemed to come straight out of a romance novel. Their wedding day was no exception. The church was filled with an array of white lilies and rose petals that dotted the aisles. Jessica wore an elegant lace gown, her long brunette hair pinned back in soft curls. Daniel, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, was the perfect picture of a dashing groom. He stood at the altar, a look of pure adoration on his face as he watched Jessica walk toward him. The guests looked on with smiles, almost expecting the day to be flawless, as it appeared to be. However, as beautiful and serene as the ceremony was, there was something hiding in the background, an undercurrent of tension that few could detect. Daniel had always been the kind of man who could compartmentalize. He was organized, meticulous, and appeared to have everything under control. But beneath this calm exterior, he harbored a secret. For over a year, he had been involved in an affair with his best friend, Kevin Lawson. Kevin, a tall, athletic man with a rough-around-the-edges demeanor, had been by Daniel's side since their high school days. They shared a bond that few could understand, a friendship forged over late-night conversations, shared dreams, and countless adventures. But over time, that bond had deepened into something else. It began as an innocent connection, but as the months passed, the two men had found themselves crossing a line they never imagined they would. Kevin was different from Jessica. He was wild, spontaneous, and often reckless, traits that Daniel found both exhilarating and terrifying. The affair had started innocently enough. Late-night texts, stolen glances, and an increasing number of meetings under the guise of catching up. But before long, their chemistry had turned physical. They spent hours together, whispering secrets in dark corners, exchanging touches that meant so much more than just friendship. Kevin had always made Daniel feel alive in a way Jessica couldn't, but despite the passion between them, Daniel had convinced himself that his future was with Jessica, that she was the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman he could build a life with. On the morning of the wedding, Daniel had tried to put thoughts of Kevin out of his mind. He loved Jessica. He had always wanted to marry her, start a family, and live the life everyone expected of them. But Kevin wasn't so easily dismissed. That morning they had shared a brief moment of tension. Kevin had pulled him aside during the rehearsal dinner the night before and told him he couldn't just walk away. He wasn't ready to lose him. The words hung in the air like a promise that Daniel couldn't ignore. And as the wedding ceremony progressed, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the man standing by his side as the best man, Kevin, who knew all of his darkest secrets, who had shared in his desires and regrets. As the reception began, Daniel and Kevin exchanged glances from across the room. There was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition that the night would not end the way it was supposed to. Both men had buried the truth for too long, but for now they had to play their parts. Daniel as the perfect groom, and Kevin as the best man, smiling through the night, pretending that everything was as it should be. But neither of them could ignore the tension that simmered beneath the surface, an unspoken reality that would soon spiral into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The evening wore on with the kind of perfection that only a wedding could offer. The chandeliers in the grand hall cast a soft golden light over the guests as they danced, mingled, and celebrated the union of Daniel and Jessica. The music played, the laughter echoed, and the clinking of glasses filled the air. For most people, it was the kind of night that would stay etched in their memories forever, a picture of love and happiness. But for Daniel and Kevin, the joy was tinged with an underlying unease that neither could shake. As the night continued, it became clear that the facade they had both carefully maintained was starting to crack. For Daniel, the conflicting emotions were overwhelming. He had stood at the altar, exchanged vows with Jessica, and promised to love her for the rest of his life. He was supposed to feel complete, to feel as though everything was falling into place. But instead, he felt trapped. He had spent the last year telling himself that the affair with Kevin was just a mistake, something he could put behind him once the wedding was over. But the truth was far more complicated. Kevin wasn't someone Daniel could simply forget. Their bond was too deep, the connection too intense, and every time Daniel caught Kevin's eye from across the room, he was reminded of what he had tried so hard to bury. Kevin, on the other hand, was consumed by jealousy and frustration. The smile he wore as the best man was thin, a mask he had perfected over the years to hide his emotions. He watched as Daniel interacted with Jessica, sharing intimate moments that were supposed to be the beginning of their future together. But in Kevin's mind, that future wasn't meant to include Jessica. She was nothing more than an obstacle standing between him and the man he loved. The affair they'd shared had been intense, but it was never enough for Kevin. He wanted more. He wanted Daniel to choose him, to leave everything behind and be with him, just the two of them. Throughout the evening, the tension between the two men grew. Kevin knew that Daniel was conflicted, and he wasn't going to let it slide. He couldn't. The affair had been his secret too, and he had risked everything for it. Now that Daniel was married, Kevin felt betrayed, abandoned for a life that didn't include him. The last few months had been an emotional roller coaster, filled with late-night arguments, desperate pleas, and broken promises. But tonight, everything felt different. There was no turning back now. As the reception began to wind down and the guests started to filter out of the ballroom, Kevin found himself alone with Daniel in a quiet corner of the venue. The air was thick with unspoken words, and neither man could avoid the truth any longer. Kevin's anger had been simmering all evening, but now it boiled over. He cornered Daniel, his voice low but sharp as he spoke, accusing him of choosing Jessica over him, of betraying him in the worst way possible. Daniel, caught off guard and frustrated by Kevin's persistence, tried to calm him down. He didn't want to argue, not on his wedding night. He had hoped that once the ceremony was over, everything would return to normal, that he could settle into his new life with Jessica and leave the past behind. But Kevin wasn't willing to let him move on so easily. He wanted answers, he wanted clarity, and most of all, he wanted Daniel to admit that the affair had meant more than just a fling. In that moment, Daniel's resolve began to falter. His guilt over the affair, the feelings he still had for Kevin, and his obligation to Jessica all collided in his mind. He loved Jessica, but the connection with Kevin was something he couldn't deny. It was something that had become too big to ignore. As they stood there in the quiet corner of the hall, the weight of their past hung heavily in the air. Neither man was ready to walk away from what they had shared, but it was clear that whatever choice Daniel made, someone would be left heartbroken, maybe even destroyed. Kevin wasn't going to let this go, not without a fight, and the fight had already begun. The night had grown darker, and the last few stragglers from the reception trickled out of the ballroom, leaving the newlyweds and their closest circle behind. Most of the guests had wished the couple well, and the cheers and music had faded into silence. But for Daniel and Kevin, the end of the evening marked the beginning of something much darker. The tension between them was palpable. A quiet storm brewing in the corners of the room. The air between them was thick with emotions that neither man could ignore anymore. Kevin was consumed by a wild mix of jealousy, anger, and desperation. He couldn't stand seeing Daniel with Jessica, couldn't stomach the idea of Daniel stepping into a future with her, leaving their shared past in the rear view. He was at a breaking point. The affair had been passionate and intense, but it had always been tainted by the knowledge that Daniel was still committed to his fiancée. Kevin had tried to be patient, to accept the limits of what they had, but as the wedding day approached, he realized that he couldn't let go. Not now. Not ever. So Daniel, on the other hand, was overwhelmed by guilt and confusion. His love for Jessica had always been real, but the bond with Kevin was something entirely different. Kevin had been his confidant, his closest friend, and for the past year they had shared more than just stolen kisses and secret meetings. The affair had become a world that Daniel couldn't fully escape, no matter how hard he tried. The passion he felt for Kevin had never dissipated. It only simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the wrong moment to explode. And now it had. There was no escaping it. The wedding was over, but the emotions he had buried for so long were beginning to surface, and there was no telling where it would lead. As the ballroom emptied, Daniel and Kevin found themselves alone in a secluded hallway near the back of the hotel. The soft hum of the building's air conditioning and the distant sounds of the final few guests packing up their belongings were the only things that filled the silence between them. Neither man spoke, but the weight of the unspoken was overwhelming. Kevin couldn't stand it any longer. He turned to Daniel, his voice trembling with frustration. He wanted to know why. Why had Daniel promised him things that were never going to happen? Why had he let the affair go on as long as it had, knowing full well that Daniel was marrying someone else? Daniel tried to stay calm, his mind racing as he searched for words to explain the unexplainable. He didn't want to hurt Kevin, but he also didn't want to hurt Jessica. He had convinced himself that the affair was just a phase, a mistake that could be left behind as soon as he said, "I do." But now, as he stood there in front of Kevin, he realized that he couldn't just erase the past. He couldn't erase what they had shared. He couldn't erase what they had shared. His love for Kevin was undeniable, but so was his commitment to Jessica. He was torn, unable to choose between the two lives that seemed to pull him in opposite directions. Kevin's frustration boiled over. He felt betrayed, deceived by the one person he had trusted most. As Daniel tried to explain, Kevin's patience snapped. In a fit of rage, he pushed Daniel back, slamming him into the cold, unforgiving wall of the hallway. The force of the impact knocked the breath out of Daniel, but he didn't resist. It was as if something inside him knew this confrontation had been inevitable. He stood there, his body pressed against the wall, caught between the fury of Kevin's words and the quiet sadness of his own heart. Kevin's eyes burned with an intensity that Daniel had never seen before. He grabbed Daniel by the collar of his tuxedo, shaking him roughly. His breath was ragged, his face twisted with anger. He accused Daniel of leading him on, of stringing him along with false promises. Kevin's voice cracked as he demanded answers. How could Daniel marry someone else after everything they had shared? How could he walk away from their connection so easily? How could he walk away from their connection so easily? The emotional weight of the moment became too much for both of them. In the heat of the argument, Kevin's grip on Daniel tightened, his rage spilling over into violence. With a surge of energy, he struck Daniel across the face, knocking him off balance. Daniel stumbled, his head spinning from the impact. But before he could regain his footing, Kevin did something that neither man would have expected. Kevin reached for a nearby object on a small table, a heavy glass vase, and in one swift motion brought it down on Daniel's head. The sound of glass shattering was deafening in the still hallway, followed by the sickening thud of the vase connecting with Daniel's skull. Time seemed to slow. Daniel's body crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide in shock as he collapsed in a pool of his own blood. Kevin stood frozen for a moment, staring down at the man he had once called his best friend, now lying motionless before him. The reality of what he had just done hit Kevin like a wave. His heart pounded in his chest as the adrenaline rushed through him. There was no going back now. What had started as a heated argument over love and betrayal had spiraled into a nightmare neither man could have imagined. As Daniel's lifeless body lay before him, Kevin's mind raced with panic and guilt, but also a sense of twisted relief. For a brief moment, he felt as though he had control over a situation that had been spiraling out of his hands for so long. But that feeling would be short-lived. The moment Kevin had struck Daniel, he had sealed both their fates, and the consequences of his actions would soon come crashing down on him. The wedding night that was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter for Daniel and Jessica had turned into a brutal and tragic end for one of them. The minutes after the attack felt like hours. Kevin stood over Daniel's motionless body, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his mind racing in 1,000 directions at once. The sharp, acrid smell of blood filled the air, but it was drowned out by the deafening silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. His hands were still trembling, stained with the evidence of what he had just done. He had never imagined it would come to this. To end Daniel's life in such a violent, senseless moment of rage. But now, as he stared down at the lifeless figure on the cold hotel floor, he knew there was no going back. Kevin's first instinct was panic. His heart hammered in his chest and his stomach churned. What had he done? He couldn't think clearly. His thoughts were a mess, a whirlpool of confusion, regret, and fear. If anyone found out what had happened, his life would be over. Everything he had worked for, the friendship with Daniel, the role as best man, the connection they had shared, would be gone in an instant. And worse, the affair they had kept hidden for so long would be exposed, the truth about their toxic relationship revealed to the world. He couldn't let that happen. Kevin glanced around the hallway, his eyes darting to the door at the end of the corridor, where he knew Jessica was still inside, completely unaware of the violence that had just unfolded. The thought of telling her, of confessing what he had done, was unbearable. She had already been so wrapped up in the fairy tale of her wedding day, so in love with Daniel. How could she ever understand? His heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt as though he might faint. How could anyone understand the depth of the betrayal and the twisted love he had felt for Daniel. Kevin knew that if Jessica knew the truth, she would never forgive him. The weight of that knowledge almost crushed him. His mind snapped back to the present moment. Daniel was dead, and the reality of that was sinking in slowly. He needed to cover up the crime. There was no time to waste. Kevin's eyes scanned the room in a frantic search for any way to make the situation less incriminating. The vase that had struck Daniel was shattered on the floor, the remnants scattered like jagged pieces of glass. The blood was pooling beneath Daniel's head, dark and thick, and it painted the floor in a way that seemed impossible to erase. Kevin swallowed hard, his throat dry. There was no easy way to fix this. But he knew that the only way to escape the consequences of his actions was to stage the scene, to make it look like an accident. He had to act quickly, decisively. He had to erase any trace of what had truly happened and make sure no one suspected foul play. If he played it right, no one would ever suspect that he had murdered his best friend. Kevin took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to come. He wiped his hands against his tuxedo pants, trying to remove the bloodstains, but there was no time to clean himself completely. He quickly turned to the door and glanced back at Daniel's body, once more feeling a sickening mix of fear and guilt. He had been so blinded by his emotions that he hadn't thought about the consequences, not truly, and now he had to live with the horror of what he had done, a burden he would carry forever. He stepped out of the hallway and into the suite where Jessica was waiting, her face still flushed with the glow of the wedding night. She was sitting on the bed, her hands nervously clutching the hem of her dress, completely unaware of the violence that had just occurred. She looked up as Kevin entered, her face brightening as she expected him to offer congratulations or talk about the evening's events. But when she saw the look in his eyes, the coldness there, something shifted in her. She felt a chill run through her. Kevin stood in the doorway, trying to compose himself, but his mind was still a whirlwind. He knew that he couldn't let Jessica see what had happened, couldn't let her know that Daniel was dead. The truth would destroy her, and Kevin couldn't allow that. He had to control the narrative. He had to make sure the story he told was the one everyone would believe. "Where's Daniel?" Kevin swallowed Jessica hard, asked, his voice tight as he forced out the words, but laced with concern. He should be here by now. I looked everywhere. I'm sorry, Jessica. I don't know where he went." Jessica furrowed her brow, confusion settling on her face. "What do you mean?" "He was just here. He promised we'd spend the night together." Kevin took a step closer, the weight of his words settling heavily on him. "I think something happened. Maybe he left. I don't know." He wasn't sure what he was saying anymore. He was lying to her face. The guilt churned in his stomach, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't tell her the truth. Jessica stood up, her face now creased with worry. "What do you mean he left? He wouldn't do that, Kevin. Are you sure?" Before she could finish, Kevin quickly moved to her side, his hand on her arm to steady her. "Listen to me, Jessica," he said urgently. "I'm going to go find him. Stay here. Don't come out until I get back, okay? I'll make sure everything's fine. Just stay here." Jessica hesitated, looking at Kevin with an unreadable expression. But after a long pause, she nodded, unsure but trusting. Kevin's heart raced as he turned and walked quickly back toward the hallway, his mind still reeling. What he had just done was irreversible, and there was no going back. As he passed the corner, his eyes flickered toward the door that led back to Daniel's lifeless body. He needed to cover his tracks. He had to make sure the murder looked like an accident, a simple misstep, and for that, he needed Jessica to believe that Daniel had left, disappeared, gone somewhere. Anything but dead. The plan was set in motion, but Kevin knew that nothing would be the same again. The darkness had already begun to close in on him. The days that followed Daniel's death were a blur of tension, confusion, and growing suspicion. Kevin had thought that the worst was over, that by staging the scene to look like an accident, he had escaped the consequences of his violent outburst. He had told Jessica that Daniel had disappeared, left the room after their heated argument, and he had made it seem like a sudden, unexplained departure. The idea was simple: make sure no one found out about the altercation, and keep the mystery surrounding Daniel's disappearance alive. Kevin convinced Jessica that they needed to wait before alerting the police, citing the possibility that Daniel had just left in a fit of anger, even though deep down, he knew that he was playing a dangerous game. As Jessica sat in the hotel suite, completely unaware of the truth, Kevin began to clean up the scene in earnest. He disposed of the broken vase, wiped down the walls where traces of Daniel's blood had splattered, and tried his best to remove every trace of the crime. But despite his frantic efforts, he knew that it was only a matter of time before someone would notice. The police would inevitably come, and his lies would crumble. His only hope was that he could hold things together long enough to cover his tracks completely. But things didn't go as planned. The following morning, as the police began their investigation, things started to unravel. The first crack in the story came when hotel staff reviewed the security footage from the night before. The cameras had captured Kevin's movements, his hurried, nervous steps as he entered Daniel's room, his anxious demeanor as he left. He had been seen wiping his hands on his pants as he passed through the hotel corridor, a detail that the police found odd. The timing of his actions didn't match the story he had told about Daniel leaving. The inconsistencies were small, but significant enough to raise suspicion. As the investigation deepened, Jessica's role in the cover-up became harder to ignore. The police brought her in for questioning. She had appeared too calm, too composed for someone who had just lost her new husband. When asked about Daniel's whereabouts, her story seemed vague, inconsistent. She had told the authorities that she didn't know where he had gone, but her nervousness during questioning caught their attention. She couldn't stop looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting as though she were waiting for someone to come forward and expose the truth. With the pressure mounting, Kevin's carefully constructed facade began to crack. The detective handling the case, a seasoned investigator named Linda Morgan, wasn't convinced by the story Kevin had woven. She had seen enough lies in her career to know when someone was hiding something. Her instincts told her that the truth wasn't being told. She requested that the hotel review the full footage of the night, and when she saw the footage of Kevin entering and exiting the room, her suspicions grew. The video didn't match Kevin's explanation. The police started to focus their attention on him. The tipping point came when Kevin's phone records were examined. They revealed text messages sent between him and Daniel hours before the wedding, filled with emotional exchanges, words of frustration and raw vulnerability. There was no denying the intensity of their relationship, no way to explain away the passion that had lingered between them. Detective Morgan realized that this wasn't a case of simple jealousy or a disagreement that got out of hand. It was something far darker. The affair between Daniel and Kevin had spiraled out of control, and Kevin had killed his best friend out of anger, obsession, and unrequited love. Kevin was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, continuing to push the narrative that Daniel had simply walked away, that he was missing. But as the detectives laid out the evidence before him, Kevin's defenses began to crumble. The recordings, the inconsistencies in his story, the traces of blood that had been carefully wiped away. All of it pointed to one chilling conclusion. Kevin had murdered Daniel. The situation had rapidly worsened. Kevin had reached his limits. Under intense pressure, Kevin finally broke. His confession came in a broken voice, choked with regret and guilt. He admitted to everything: the affair, the confrontation, and the brutal killing. He explained how the jealousy and anger had built up over the course of the year, how he couldn't stand to watch Daniel marry Jessica when he knew the truth about their relationship. In a fit of rage, he had lashed out, striking Daniel with the vase, the violent act of betrayal sealing both their fates. But even more shocking was the revelation that Jessica had been complicit in the cover-up. At first, she had been in shock, unable to comprehend the depth of what had happened. But Kevin, manipulative and convincing, had told her they needed to act quickly. They had moved Daniel's body and staged the scene to look like an accident, desperate to avoid the truth coming to light. Jessica, terrified and confused, had gone along with the plan, believing that if they kept quiet long enough, they could salvage their lives and avoid the public scandal. When the truth finally came out, the community was left in disbelief. The once perfect couple, the shining example of love, had been torn apart by a violent, twisted love triangle. Daniel's death was not just the result of a single moment of rage, but the culmination of a year-long affair that had poisoned everything it touched. Kevin, driven by obsession and jealousy, had destroyed the life of the man he claimed to love. And Jessica, too, was left shattered by her role in the cover-up. The small town of Silverbrook, which had once felt so safe and innocent, was left to reckon with the dark reality of the betrayal that had unfolded behind closed doors. The final twist came when the police discovered the letters Daniel had written to Kevin in the weeks leading up to the wedding, letters filled with sorrow and doubt. Daniel had known he was trapped, torn between two worlds he couldn't reconcile. He had tried to end the affair with Kevin, to make a fresh start with Jessica. But Kevin hadn't been ready to let go. The emotional weight of those letters painted a picture of a man torn apart by the choices he had made, unable to escape the suffocating grip of his past. The story of Daniel Hughes, Kevin Lawson, and Jessica Parker would forever be a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how obsession, betrayal, and lies could destroy lives in the blink of an eye. What had begun as a picture-perfect wedding night had ended in a brutal tragedy, one that would haunt the people involved for the rest of their lives. End.